In the Shinto spiritual tradition, there is, I guess the core of it is honoring nature and honoring the environment. And the belief is that the deities, the spirits, live around us and they live in the trees, the plants, the lakes, whatever. And these shrines, whether they be very, very small shrines or whether they be grand shrines, honor a particular deity or honor a particular spirit in that particular location.
Hey everyone, I'm Matt Payne, and this is episode 474 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen. Today, I'm joined by Ulana Switucha, and I have to say, her photography is absolutely stunning. Quiet, refined, minimalist in the best sense of the word, and deeply intentional. Recording this conversation was an absolute joy. We talk about her journey in photography and her decade-long Torii project across Japan and how photography can become a meditative, deeply present practice. Before we dive in, I want to give a heartfelt thank you to our latest Patreon supporters, Paul Larson, Jana Mengeed, and today's guest herself, Ulana Switucha. I love when guests step up to support the show. It means a lot. If you're getting value from these conversations and want to keep them going, Patreon is the best way to do it. You can join for free or become a paid supporter at patreon.com/fstop and listen. It's what keeps this podcast independent and thriving. Okay, let's dive into this week's conversation with Ulana Switucha. All right, Ulana Switucha, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Matt. Great being here.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited for this. I'm always interested in learning how people living in different parts of the world are interpreting those locations through the camera. And so I'm really eager to hear how you're doing that where you live.
Well, I'm a Canadian who lives in Hong Kong, and I've lived here for 30 years. I started photography, I guess, when I was just a young child. I've got to that typical, stereotypical photograph of me wearing a pretty dress and a brownie camera around my neck somewhere in the family archives. And my father had a dark room in my mother's laundry room. So I kind of grew up with photography. He had lots of cameras. There was the usual family snaps. When I was a teenager, the family moved to Japan, and there I received my first film camera when I graduated from high school, and that sort of started the first part of my journey. A few days after receiving that camera, I climbed Mount Fuji, and I recall the moment when I saw the sunrise from the top of Mount Fuji that, this is something that I really wanted to spend some time with was photography. Then fast forwarding, getting back to Canada, going to university, during the corporate life, I ended up in Hong Kong with the company that I was working with, and I've lived there ever since. And that was about the 1995 we arrived here. After leaving the corporate life, I pursued photography full time, and that brings us up to today.
What was the corporate world like for you? What kind of work was that?
It was in the financial industry. It was typical high stress, fast paced. Luckily, lots of travel in the Asian region. So I got to see a lot of places, both personally and through business. And photography was always a way of just escaping the pressures of day to day life and getting out into primarily nature, but also into other worlds, other environments and cultures, and experiencing just something a little bit different than what we did day to day.
Yeah, that's something I would love to hear you talk about because you've lived in Hong Kong for 30 years, and I'd be really curious to hear how living in Asia has influenced the way that you see and photograph landscape and culture.
That's an interesting question because Asia has so much to offer, and it's such a varied region. It provides a lot of different cultures. It provides a lot of different topography. So I've been here 30 years, and I think I've just scratched the surface of exploring all of the photographic opportunities.
Yeah, I'm a little jealous. I've actually never been to Asia yet, so it's definitely something I want to do in the near future. But for now, we'll just have to live vicariously through your work.
Thank you. Well, I started off with travel photography, and I found that as I came to understand the cultures better, and as I came to explore some of the locations better, then I think, moved into a more focused style of photography and tried to tell and tried to communicate my experience and my connection with what I was seeing.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing for photographers to do in terms of putting a little bit of thought into what we photograph on a deeper level and why we photograph it and what it means to us. And it sounds like you've spent a lot of time doing that for yourself.
Yes, that's true. And I think as I went through this photographic journey, and particularly when I discovered long exposure through Michael Kenna's work, that would have been, I guess, almost 20 years ago. I found that that was really the niche and the area that I enjoyed the most was the simplicity and the calm and meditative aspects of long exposure and of being present in the scene.
I could see that that type of photography would be really appealing for someone who's working in the stressful world of the financial district.
Well, not only that, but living in a big city like Hong Kong, which is, I guess like living in New York or London or Paris, where you've got a high density population, it's great to get out into nature and it's great to practice photography as a way of just connecting with your world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to talk a little bit about your upbringing in photography. I know that in the late 90s, you participated in a documentary street project in Kowloon with the Cathay Camera Club that was later published by the Royal Asiatic Society. And I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about that project and what it taught you.
That was a very interesting project. I just arrived in Hong Kong, so I joined the Cathay Camera Club and learned black and white photography through participating with the members of that club. And to this day, I still have very strong friendships with people that I met way back then. They've dispersed around the world, but we still stay connected. And the Royal Asiatic Society, they approached the Cathay Camera Club to document a historic neighborhood in Hong Kong called Yama. Some of it has disappeared, other parts of it are still there, and some of it has been restored and is now like a tourist destination or so on. But the whole idea of the project was to document the life before it disappeared. Of course, we had no idea what would disappear, what would not disappear, but we spent about 2 to 3 years, pounding the streets, mostly on weekends, because most of us worked, and photographing the people, the life, the buildings, the details, the landscape, I guess the cityscape. And it's quite interesting now to wander through that same area when I have visitors and I sort of show them the old Hong Kong, because some of it has indeed disappeared. The bird market, for example, got moved from a very gritty, narrow alley to a much more specially built purpose, whereas other places like Shanghai Street remain intact. So not all of it has gone, but I'm glad that we had the chance to document what has changed. And I really am glad for the opportunity to have been introduced to black and white photography and to, I guess, street photography would be the genre that would best describe what we did.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that being able to work on a project like that so early in your photography journey can really help shape your approach to other future projects and the way that you approach photography today. I mean, you had mentioned like capturing the big scenes and the details and the street scenes and everything about what it's like to be there. And I could see that being a really useful technique that you were probably able to translate forward in the work you're doing today in Japan.
I lived in Japan at a very early age, so I've got a very strong emotional connection to the culture and so on. So I find that when I do visit there, it's not just Tories and it's not just architecture, which I think my most recent portfolios focus on, but I do like to just wander around the streets and take photographs of the culture. Also in the villages, the culture there is something that really appeals to me because it's vanishing, it's disappearing. There's an issue with depopulation, there's an issue with modernization. Of course, that happens in other countries too. And I do enjoy very much just looking at and being present with what I remember back in the 70s.
Earlier, you mentioned that in 2008, you discovered Michael Kenna's work. And I know that for a lot of people, Michael Kenna's work has been really instrumental in terms of helping us discover a more minimalistic landscape. And his work from Hokkaido has really put that place on the map. I'm curious for you, having discovered that work and pivoting towards long exposure, what was it about his photography and that style that really clicked for you?
It was the simplicity and his ability to really communicate the subject to you in a very clear composition. I also enjoyed the black and white aspect of it because I do both color photography and black and white, but I found that I was being drawn more and more to black and white as I studied long exposure.
Yeah, there's something about minimalism that I'm really drawn to as well, in terms of just being able to distill a subject down to what makes it its core essence, and then really using that core essence as a vehicle to communicate something to the viewer. I think that's a really fun way to approach photography.
It's also a very powerful way of presenting your subject, in my opinion. I find that if I'm in a forest or if I'm in a city now, I find it a little bit more difficult to get rid of the clutter around me. I used to be able to, I thought, effectively photograph scenes like that, but now I'm finding them more and more challenging. I think it takes a very skilled eye for those who do woodland photography and nature photography to really present that scene as strongly as they do.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. And you can do minimalism in nature as well. And it's something that I love to do when I get the opportunity. And it's something I love to teach as well. I think distilling something down to its core essence really does help communicate to the viewer what you exactly were drawn to, which I think a lot of us struggle with in photography.
Yeah, similar to what you recently posted online, your most recent portfolio. Beautiful shots.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. So you mentioned long exposure, and I'm a big fan of long exposure as well. And it's becoming more and more central to the types of images that you create. Beyond the technical side, what does long exposure give you emotionally and perhaps philosophically?
That's a great question because to me, I enjoy going out, even if it's 3 a.m. in the morning, wait, because I have to get somewhere by dawn. I just look forward to standing there by the beach with the waves lapping around a Torii gate or a rock or a scene, whatever it might be, and just taking that time to yourself and enjoying the environment around you. This can be also repeated, in an urban setting. Quite often I'll go down to Hong Kong Harbor early in the morning before there's too much boat traffic and try and capture the cityscape with sort of a long exposure effect. It kind of stills everything around me, and it brings sort of, I don't want to sound too cliche about this, but it brings serenity. From a photographic perspective, that quietness allows more focus and more awareness of what it is I'm doing, what it is I'm shooting, how I want to communicate as well, what it is about that particular scene that I think would be very effective as a photograph in the end.
Yeah, for me, what I love about long exposure is two things. One is that you're demonstrating the effect of time on a scene, and two, it's like you never know exactly what's going to come out on the other side of it. Like it's always a fun little experiment, and I love that about long exposure because sometimes it's like, well, that didn't work, and then other times it's like, whoa, I didn't expect that. That's amazing. So I love that about long exposure.
I totally agree with you, especially in the morning or in the evening when you're facing changing light, as the sun is rising or as the sun is setting. And you just have to get that exposure right in camera. And it's really hard to predict what filter to put on, how long to go as the light is changing. So you look at your screen and you didn't nail it, so you have to go again, but the light has changed. So it becomes a bit of a process, and there's a little bit of thinking behind it. But in the end, there's usually one shot that works out. The other aspect is whether or not you're able to smooth out the water or get rid of the clouds or soften the clouds, whatever the objective might be, and what sort of exposure you need to use, depending on the speed of the clouds or the waves in the water, or sometimes the tourist boat that kind of plows through and leaves a wake in the water. So there's all sorts of challenges involved, and totally agree. Although I like to know what I'm getting, you never really know.
No, no, and it's that's why I'm drawn to it, because it's just always a fun little experiment, and every time I go into it, I'm like, well, this is what I think is gonna happen, but we'll see. I love that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So so I know that you've describe photographing the Japanese spiritual landscape as meditative. How does long exposure change your relationship to time in the field?
Long exposure is an investment in time itself. So you do have to give yourself, you can't just show up, take a few photographs and leave. You do have to, I usually go out and I look at if I can, I look at the location beforehand to really understand what sort of compositions I would prefer to take, so that when I arrive at dawn or at dusk, which are my preferred times for shooting, I'm not struggling with anything like that. So I can sort of focus on getting the job done. Setting up the filters and getting the composition right, that all takes time. And then there's the time of just doing the long exposure and just enjoying the moment and clutching that can of coffee or whatever. So it becomes a different type of journey than if you were to go into a forest, let's say,
Hmm.
where you wouldn't have to use the same type of equipment.
Yeah. So I know you mentioned that you have a early childhood connection with Japan and you have a lot of emotional ties to it. But I'd really love to hear you talk about why. Like, why Japan? What is it about Japan, about its geography, about your spiritual connection to that place that continues to draw you back?
Well, let's talk about geography first, because it looks really small on the map, but the country's actually quite big. If you superimpose it on Europe, it extends from Denmark down to Spain. If you superimpose Japan on North America, it's from Vermont down to Florida.
Wow,
So it's a
I didn't know
pretty,
that.
yeah, it's a pretty long country. Yeah, offers a lot of geography. It's got a spine of mountains down the middle of the main island, Honshu. It has beautiful coastlines, lots of fiddly bits in the coastlines. Very, very rugged. 70% is forested. The weather is subarctic up in Hokkaido, right down to tropical down in Okinawa or even Kyushu, where I just recently spent about 5 weeks shooting. So it's got a lot going for it, and I think you can't really see it in 2 weeks. Let's put it that way. It takes a long time to really explore all of the potential of the country. Now, as far as my connection goes, that has to do with my background there and just living there during my earliest years. So I speak Japanese a little bit, enough to get around. I understand the culture, and I do enjoy the awareness and simplicity of what I am seeing in both the culture and in the environment that I see.
Yeah, and it's got such a rich history in terms of going back centuries. And I've always appreciated Japanese culture and even modern Japanese culture in terms of like the values that they have. They place a high value on quietness and being contemplative, and they place a high value on being clean and picking up after yourself and picking up trash and not being a messy person and being part of a cohesive culture that kind of moves the same direction together. So I really like that about Japan a lot.
Yeah, well, I hope one day you get to visit it because I think you'll really, really enjoy it. But you make a very valid point because there's also another aspect of their landscape and the environment in Japan, and that is the sculpted landscape. It's the controlled landscape, the gardens, the parks, and the even the architecture is very much in tune with nature. And there's an awful lot of creativity in the modern architecture that is derived from that connection with nature and that connection with the environment that goes back centuries. But one of the things I found out as I was researching a little bit more in depth about Torii gates and the Japanese culture and some of these locations that I ended up in is that historical and very, very long-lived connection to the mythology of how Japan was created, and the sun goddess and the sun god coming down, creating Japan, and how each one of these locations somehow tied in with the fables and legends of Japan, which continue to this day in different ways.
So let's talk about your connection to the landscape. And you'd mentioned Torii Gates. So maybe tell us a little about Torii Gates, because I feel like for a lot of people who don't know much about Japan, maybe they've never even heard of Torii Gates, or maybe they have a vague idea of what they are. And most people probably don't even know what they represent or what they're about. So would love to hear you talk about that.
Well, a Torii gate is, I think a lot of people have seen in, tourist brochures, the Torii gate, the big red gate in front of a shrine. And it is essentially the gateway from the real world into the spiritual world. And beyond the Torii gate, there will be a shrine or a sacred place. And it could be a grand shrine and a grand Torii gate like you see in the tourist brochures, or it could be a very small gate at the side of the road that leads into the forest, and there'll be a spiritual element, whether it be a small little shrine or it might be a rock or a tree or something that has a spiritual connection to nature and to the environment. In my book, I asked Olivier Robert, who is a black and white photographer who lives in Japan and an author on Japanese culture, if I could reproduce one of his articles on Torii and Shinto. And he explains it so much better than I do. And it is a spiritual symbol which needs to be honored. As you enter through a Torii gate, you should bow as you go in and bow when you leave. But what you find beyond it will depend on the location.
And, I personally don't find myself being hyper spiritual in terms of a religious sense, but when I spend time in nature, I definitely feel a spiritual connection to nature and to the natural places that I visit. And I can imagine that others in our past felt similarly. And in the case of the Japanese, they decided to memorialize that feeling through the use of these gates.
Yes, in the Shinto spiritual tradition, there is, I guess the core of it is honoring nature and honoring the environment. And the belief is that the deities, the spirits, live around us and they live in the trees, the plants, the lakes, whatever. And these shrines, whether they be very, very small shrines or whether they be grand shrines, honor a particular deity or honor a particular spirit in that particular location.
So you just dropped a little hint that you have a whole book about this stuff, and I was really hoping that I could learn more about your book. And I know that you've designed it a little bit as like a visual journey, and you even have some transparent pages that help guide the viewer. I'd love for you to tell us about the book and what it's about.
Well, it's a collection of the photographs that I've taken over the last 10 years of Torii gates, both in the water and in the snow. Was some discussion about including Torii gates that were land-based and kind of a different type of composition, but they didn't quite make the cut because the flow of the book was very important. When I was first approached about publishing this book with my co-publisher, Blue Lotus Editions, I took a workshop which they held about how to do a photo book. And we learned all about sequencing, the science of sequencing, the visual design of sequencing, and ended up with a very nice collection of photographs, which was rather documentary. When we handed over that collection to a book designer, she completely changed it. And she created this journey, which we didn't touch at all because it was just so well done. So you enter into the ocean, you enter from the ocean through a photograph of the horizon, and that's on transparent pages. And then you encounter your first Torii gate, which is a white Torii gate on the beach. And I can come back to that later about why some are white and some are red. And then you just wander through to various islands and beaches, and eventually you end up on land and you see snow. And then there's some more transparent pages that transition you to your climb up to the summit of a mountain where you encounter a Torii gate that is covered in snow, similar to those, trees that you see that are completely encased in snow. And that is the journey. So what she did, and I think she did very effectively, is to have you understand not only the different types of Torii gates, but understand the different types of topography of the Japanese landscape as you go through. At the end of the book, there is this article, as I mentioned, by Olivier Robert, which gives you a lot more in-depth explanation of what Shinto is and what Torii gates are.
That's
Uh,
beautiful.
and get and then getting back to white and red. So I'm often asked about why some Torii gates are red, because those are the ones you see when you look at, tourist brochures and social media and so on, and why some are white. Because I have discovered white ones. I've even discovered some multicolored ones on my last trip. And there is a story behind that. Originally, Torii gates were white, and they were just very simple, two poles with a cross beam, and you enter into the sacred area. But over time, as Buddhism came to Japan and Shintoism and Buddhism started to merge, they started to color the Torii gates red. Then after the Meiji Restoration, when Buddhism and Shintoism were then separated again, then they started to move back to white Torii gates in some cases. But you can also find them just made out of wood, like in Meiji Shrine in Tokyo, or concrete or stone, and different materials. I saw one the other day that was made out of acrylic, and I think that was more of a touristy thing, though.
I would love to hear a little bit more about how you found these things, because I understand that they're actually somewhat rare. How did you research and discover all these locations over the course of the 10 years that you created the project?
The Torii gates in the water are indeed hard to find, and they are rare. But Torii gates themselves are found everywhere in Japan. So we have to sort of focus that discussion only on Torii gates in the water. And I started that journey because of long exposure photography. I found a few Torii gates, and they eventually started looking for more and more and more. So over a course of 10 years, started almost on a journey to find as many as I could find to make a body of work. To find them was not easy, beyond the ones that are known or have become known due to social media and tourism and so on. So I go to Google Maps before I go on a trip, decide where I'm going, and start looking just by drilling down into Google Maps and trawling up the coastline with my finger on my mouse, looking for little symbols for Shinto or for Myoto Iwa, which are the rocks with the ropes in between. And largely you can find some very interesting locations. Other times, just by driving down into remote villages, I have driven down into a village and found the most beautiful scene of a torii on an island facing the harbor of a very small village with, fishing boats and the whole thing. So both experiences have brought me to some very, very interesting and very quiet locations.
As you were photographing these Torii gates, I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit about how you decided how much of the Torii gate should be the emphasis of the image versus like how much scale it occupies within the frame versus maybe it's a small part of the scene or it's a dominant part of the scene. Like, how did you work through that when you were composing these photographs?
It depended on the environment of that photograph. So the standalone tories that are on the beach, for example, I think those work really, really well, and they become a very powerful subject. And they do actually capture the essence of what I was feeling at the time, being on the beach, listening to lapping waves, and just having silence around me. But then you've got other tories that are on islands or they are, perched elsewhere. And there you just have to work with the landscapes. Or if there's like a bridge leading to it, you work with the bridge that leads to it. So there are different compositions for different locations. And then there are a lot of locations that just didn't work particularly well because the gate was too far away, or it just didn't have the presence that I was hoping once I took the photograph.
It occurs to me, at least the way you described it, that the book was sequenced well after the fact of you actually creating the images, which I think is a pretty normal approach to creating a book. However, I'm curious to hear if or how at all you would have changed the approach to photographing the Torii gates, having knowledge of how it would be laid out and sequenced before you captured them. Would that have changed at all?
I don't think so, because I think each location has its own story, its own presence, and its own experience. And this, as I mentioned, I just got back from 5 weeks in Kyushu, and my friend and I, also interested in photographing Japanese landscapes, we found a lot of very, very unknown locations. And I just will continue to photograph what I find even after the book has been published. I don't think in any one moment that I feel regretful, oh, I wish this was in the book. I didn't feel that at all. I just continue to enjoy photography, enjoy the locations, and the other things that we find along the way as well.
I know a lot of photographers are really interested in curating their work and putting it into a book. I just got done doing that for myself, and it's quite the endeavor. I'd be curious if you had any formal advice for people who might have a pretty substantial body of work, but they're not quite sure how it might create something like a book, what would you tell them in terms of trying to work out a process for making a cohesive something out of it?
Well, I think you're probably more expert in this than I am. For me, it was a very, very difficult journey. Luckily, I had a lot of people around me who gave me a lot of very good advice. And I think that that's part of the process is having somebody who can help you with the sequencing, having someone who can advise you on the paper, having a good printer and all of that technical stuff. In fact, I think the sequencing and the photography was the easy part. The hard part was the actual technical part, for me anyway, of putting the book together. And luckily, I had people around me that steered me in the right direction, that helped me pick the cover, that helped me pick the right paper. Having said that, there's nothing that really prepares you for the little technical challenges that come up along the way that you have to deal with when publishing a book, like, the paper all of a sudden is not available and you have to change paper at the last minute, things like that. So it's not easy, is what I would have to say, but it's very rewarding once you finish.
Yeah, and
How
having
was your experience?
same. I found the easy part for me was actually, like you said, the sequencing and laying it out and figuring out what I wanted the book to be and how it would flow. Oddly enough, that was pretty easy for me because I had a vision for what I wanted the book to be before I started that process. The hard part for me was actually just the design, like literally like figuring out how to use InDesign and moving stuff around and learning shortcuts on how do I resize the photo to fit this space? And how do I create a little photo box that, man, the text is not in the right place and all that kind of stuff that was frustrating. So that was probably the hardest part of the journey for me. And then, like actually getting it off the ground in terms of fundraising and marketing and all that, that's a whole other monster that you have to slay as well.
That's a different discussion, isn't it? Yeah, I was lucky I didn't have to use InDesign. The designer that I hired, lovely young lady, very, very creative. She did all of that work, but I did have to think about CMYK conversion, for example, and resize things so that she could put it into InDesign. So there was an awful lot of technical stuff that came into play. And then, of course, the color management of the photographs so that they moved into CMYK seamlessly. That was difficult as well because you had to learn all about that.
Yeah, oddly enough, I found that part super easy, but I think it's because I had a conceptual framework for how it works. And then through my competition, my co-founder Tim, he does all the book design for those books, and he stumbled across this really amazing InDesign plugin that does all the CMYK conversion for you. And then all you have to do is like just once it's done, you look at it on a calibrated screen and make sure it looks good and make a couple of tweaks here and there, but for the most part, you're good to go. So that actually wasn't too bad. That plugin was actually amazing.
So that's a handy tip, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you edited your images, and how that influenced how you capture in the field. Because I think a lot of people don't necessarily think in that order. In other words, I'm curious, how did you see the final image before you exposed the image?
Well, normally I sort of have an idea of what I want before I click the shutter. It doesn't always work out that way, and it doesn't have to work out that way. Sometimes it does, and sometimes as you said, it doesn't, right? But for this particular body of work, I wanted something that was silence, contemplative, and something that was very minimalist. So I focused on getting the water smoothed out, the skies as clear as possible. Once I got into editing, I found that over the 10-year period, the editorial skills changed, and
Yes.
and also the editing was pretty much all over the place. So in putting together a body of work that was cohesive, there was a need to harmonize a little bit between images to make sure that there was a flow from in terms of color management and other elements as well. But when I go out and I shoot, there's sort of like a core visual that I have, which is a very quiet, contemplative photograph.
It's interesting. I had a similar experience recently. Was in Yellowstone for about 8 days, and I photographed a lot of really interesting forest scenes. But when I photographed those scenes, I knew right away that I wanted them to have more of a lighter feeling to them, more whimsical, a little less contrasty than I normally would do. And so when I was editing them, I found myself actually doing like negative dehaze and negative clarity and like the exposure up really, really high and like really blowing out highlights and things like that intentionally, which is very unusual for me typically. So I think when you have that kind of a vision going into a scene like that, it can help shape how you edit for sure.
That raises a very good question about, how far do you edit? And in my opinion, I think the editorial process is as important as taking the photograph itself. And if you're going to communicate a particular message, it's okay to add negative dehaze. It's okay to add negative clarity because that's part of what you saw and what you experienced and what you're trying to communicate. So and in particular, if you're trying to harmonize a body of work so that there is a flow, then you will have to employ a few tweaks here and there to make that work as a story.
Right. And then if you're talking about translating to a medium of some sort, whether that be a book or a print or a series of prints or whatever, then that's even the whole next level in terms of like understanding how you have to tweak those edits even further to get to that point to where they're ready for that medium that you've chosen.
Exactly. And that's a whole different skill level is learning how to move from standalone one photograph to looking at a body of work, or even before that, just a series of work, a series of three, a series of 10, for example, and then moving into a larger piece of work. When I presented these Torii gates for the first time at a photographer's meeting that was sponsored by the co-publisher, I really did not feel that it was a cohesive body of work at all. I just wanted feedback from the room. And that sort of feedback is very helpful. People saying, well, you should change this, you should change that. And I really did welcome that and appreciated what the opinions of others and took those opinions, and formed the final body of work using some of the suggestions that were made.
Yeah, it's interesting getting feedback from people because I sought some feedback, especially on the cover design for my book. And I think I asked like 6 people and I got 6 completely different answers. And I was like, well,
Mhm.
I'll maybe incorporate a few of those ideas here and there, but eventually I just like you got to just stick to your guns too. So I don't know about you, but the hardest part for me was like just being brutal with yourself in terms of like, I love this photo, but it just doesn't work. Or man, I really want to include this photo, even though it's not my best image, but it helps the book in this way. That last piece, that part was hard for me. Like forcing myself to use images that I know aren't my best but knowing that including them actually helps tell the story of the book, that's a hard one right there.
Absolutely. There are some images in the book that are there because from a design perspective, they link you in that journey. They link you from A to C, for example, or they bring you from ocean to land, for example. There were other images that I brought after the book was already sequenced, and I said, "Hey, this one's really good. I just took this a month ago, and it just didn't work. They couldn't fit it in anywhere." So you'll find at the end of the book, there's actually the ones that hit the floor. They're put in opposite to the article, or sort of as a addendum to the book. So we kind of were able to include a few more in there that I thought should be included.
I did the same thing. I used some of those images as like a low transparency background for like table of contents, for example, so that it's like you can see the text, but you can tell there's an image behind it, but it's maybe like, and that was kind of painful. It's like, I really love this photo, but if I make it too opaque, you won't be able to read the text.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, those kind of decisions in bookmaking are just like it kills you. At least it did
Yeah,
me. I
it
don't
didn't.
know.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think I have a different view. I just kind of went, yeah, well, whatever. You've got to look at the whole, even though you know that particular image is very strong. It just doesn't work, and I could see why it didn't work, so I accepted that.
Yeah, I relied on my wife. I'm like, is this too opaque? She's like, yeah, that's way too opaque. I'm like, okay, fine.
Yeah, yeah. My husband is actually my best critic. I'll show him something and he'll go, not your best work.
Oh yeah, that's how it works in my house too. So I wanted to ask you a question about like when you approach a project like this and you're making plans to go capture images, how do you balance like planning and being open to surprise? What does that look like for you?
Well, planning is important because you have to decide where you're going. And if you're working on a particular project, then that kind of forms the core of your plan. So over the last few years, as I've gotten more and more serious into creating bodies of work, that has been more important in the planning than it used to be, where I would just show up and just see what would happen. So right now, that is, I say, the primary reason why I go shooting. Having said that, I am totally open to just wandering down the village and seeing what else I can find, or wandering down an alley in Tokyo and seeing if there's something interesting there, or even in Hong Kong, just exploring a new neighborhood. So I think you have to balance the two, because I am personally finding that over planning stifles creativity in my case. And I'm finding that if I allow the time to go out and explore, or stop the car because I see something really interesting, that makes for a much more fulfilling day for me.
Yeah, I'm the same. I used to approach my photography very structured and rigid, and I had plans and I had locations and I even had kind of like shot lists, if you will. And didn't work very well for me. I mean, I would get good photos, but like 75% of my trips, I would come home just mad because I didn't get the list checked off, right? And so whenever I switched over to like just being more open to like just discovering things and being more open to not really caring if I come home with something cool, that completely transformed my photography journey. And I've been so much more happy as a result of that.
Yeah, I think being able to go out and explore and retaining that element of exploration, no matter where you go, or whether it's a dedicated trip or just you're wandering about with your camera, allows you to be open to new ideas and new projects.
Mm.
So if you stop that element of your particular journey, then I think you're losing out on something that might be your next project, might be your next body of work, or something really exciting that you can communicate.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And if you don't make any plans, then you'll just never leave the house. So like that's where the balance comes in. You do have to make some plans.
Well, if you don't make any plans, then you don't show up at this, and you go to the location, it might be at the wrong time of day, or it could be that it's low tide and it should have been high tide. And there are a
Right.
lot of things that enter into planning and getting, well, some of the mountain shots that you do with just, that kiss of light on the mountaintops. That's not because, you just showed up after your coffee. You were there because you planned, right?
For sure. And I love that you brought up tides because I don't live near an ocean. So, like, tides are so mysterious to me. I mean, I get it, but like, I'm not around enough to like fully incorporate it into the way I think about doing coastal photography. And I did a trip to Spain a few years ago with my buddy Kane. And we had all these location lists and we're like, oh, let's go here, let's go here. But we forgot to think about tides. And there was one particular location, like it's very, very dependent on high tide. And when we first got there, I was like, this is not what it's supposed to look like at all. But it was amazing because the low tide exposed this just rugged, insane landscape that we could actually walk out into. Whereas at high tide, you can't go out there at all. And it was amazing photography. Like, and I had never seen anyone else photograph that beach at low tide before. I'm not saying they're the best photographs ever made, but it was really, really fun. And so once again, like just be open to experimentation, right?
Yes, there is a photograph in the book that has three Torii gates in the water. It's like a panel, and that is definitely a high tide location because it's on flats that go out, for miles and miles. So you do want to be there at the right time to get that particular shot with all three of the gates in the water. But I've seen photographers, and I've been there as well at low tide, and it also makes for a very interesting photograph because you do see the bed, and you do see that there's actually a rocky path that leads through those Torii gates to the ultimate shrine, which is on an island way, way beyond where the shore is. So either way could work very effectively. It just depends on what you want to do.
You just gave me an idea for that scene. If I was there, I would love to go photograph that scene at high tide and remember exactly where my tripod holes were, and then come back and photograph it at low tide in the exact same spot, same focal length, do the pano like you described, and then in Photoshop find a way to blend it to where like the Torii gate on the right and the Torii gate on the left had high tide, and then you blended it to where the one in the middle had low tide. That would be really cool looking. Maybe. I don't know. That's just where my brain went.
That would be very creative. It's not been done before that I've seen.
Well,
Yeah,
now
that would be
you can
very
steal my
effective.
idea and go do it.
I'll book the flight tomorrow. Just kidding. But one thing I learned about tides, which I wasn't aware of, is that on the Pacific side of Japan, you have your usual tides, which are, that swing, fairly significantly depending on where you are. But on the Sea of Japan side, which is the western side between Japan and Korea, Japan and Russia, the Sea of Japan tides are minuscule. So there's actually not much difference. And I didn't realize that until I started researching that. So that's another element to be aware of when you're out doing that sort of research, that some locations give you huge wide swings and other locations give you nothing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I just got back from Norway and we had that experience at a few beaches where it was like, oh, we need to really be back here at low tide because it's going to be way better, and vice versa, high tide's better. So I think understanding how tides can affect a scene is important, and it's fun to get there at the wrong time and try to figure out a way to make it work.
Absolutely.
Yeah, embrace those mistakes and make the best of it, you know? So I wanted to ask you about yoga. I don't think I've ever talked to any other photographer that has found a way to incorporate yoga into their photography. So I know you've studied yoga and you've written about photography as a meditative practice, which is what yoga is as well. What parallels do you see between the breath work in yoga and composing the photographs?
Well, I've been practicing yoga for, I don't know, 20, 30 years, something like that. And I took up teacher training because I thought I wanted to be a yoga teacher, which in the end decided not to do. But it was a very useful course to go through because I learned a lot more about what yoga was all about and about, the background and the poses and so on. And we had to write these essays about the philosophy. So one day I wrote about the parallels of yoga and photography because they were both very important and still are very important in my life. And on the surface, you have a pose, and on the surface, you have a photograph. But what was behind that pose and what was behind that photograph? And to me, there were a lot of parallels that I discovered. The fact that to get into the pose, you have your breath work, you have your intention, you have your focus. Everything else around you goes quiet because you're focused on getting into the pose, or you're focused on the sitting and doing your meditation or whatever you might be doing in that particular practice. In photography, you have your focus, you have your subject, and eventually things go quiet around you as you practice your photography, as you look at what the composition of that particular photograph would be. So this is something that I thought was quite interesting. And I think while I was photographing, it was in a way a meditative practice because I was feeling the same things that I was feeling while I was doing my yoga practice. So
Mm.
that's where that comes from.
It makes total sense to me. I mean, I think about when I'm by myself in nature with the camera and I'm trying to make sense of the scene with the camera. It is somewhat of a meditative practice, and there's a lot of parallels in terms of trying to understand how to distill the scene down to its core elements and using the scene in a way to draw the viewer's eye to certain parts of the photograph. So I can totally see it being all the parallels being there. So I think it makes complete sense. All right, so I've got a couple more questions for you. One, how can people learn more about your book?
They can go to my website, ulanaswituchaphotography.com, which is dedicated to looking at the book and to exploring some of the contents, and they can buy it through that website.
Perfect. And then my last question is, who do you recommend for the podcast? Who are some people that our listeners need to learn more about?
I've got 5 people that I thought of. First is Kino Sato. He's a Japanese photographer that I met last year, and he is a documentary photographer that focuses on Japanese culture and Japanese social issues. Most recently, his work has focused on depopulation and the environmental impact in Japan. So I would recommend his work, and his book, X Elements, is really a very powerful story through photographs of that Japan that is fading and fading fast in many of the rural areas. The second person that I would recommend is Yukari Chikura, and she did a book called Zaido, and that's how I found out about her. She's a fine art photographer, a composer, also an artist. And her book Zaido is a very personal journey that she had as a result of loss. And she went to her father's home village in northern Japan, and over a course of several years, she photographed this once a year festival that takes place at New Year's. And it's a very, very powerful book. It's got outstanding photography, and the storytelling in it about this particular festival is very, very compelling. The third photographer is a Brazilian called Gui Christ, and he focuses on social issues in Latin America. His most recent work, which he is still working on, is about the Afro religions in Brazil. And his portraiture work, in addition to his storytelling, is really very unique and really tells us a lot about that particular tradition that he's photographing. So in all three of those, I think what draws me to their style of photography is their ability to engage in long-term projects and pull together in totally different ways, a book or a body of work, because I don't think that Gui has published yet, pull together a story that tells you about their experience or a particular topic. The fourth photographer is Mark Kogel. And full disclosure, Mark is one of my mentors, and he taught me long exposure photography. And he's a black and white photographer. He sees black and white. He breathes and he lives black and white. He doesn't do color, as he says. He's got a very interesting collection of photographs from the prairies, both on the Canadian and American side of the border, of the landscapes in the prairies, particularly in the winter, as well as other scenes that or other bodies of work that you might be interested in. And finally is Austin Bell. Austin, I met here in Hong Kong. He's an American from North Carolina, and he has photographed all 2,500 plus basketball courts in Hong Kong, mostly with his drone, but also, on the court themselves. He's published a book, he's done an exhibition. And if you go to his website, you'll find that this is not all. He's actually photographed basketball courts around the world and probably has the largest collection of basketball court photography. He's photographed in New York City and Puerto Rico, all sorts of other places. So I would encourage you to check him out as well.
What an interesting project. That's cool, though.
It took him a few years to do that, too.
I bet. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule, and we'll make sure we'll put links to everything in the show notes. Thank you again. I really appreciate it and had a great time.
Thank you, Matt, for having me. I really appreciated chatting with you and finally meeting you face to face, even though it's over the internet.
Yes, you as well. Well, thanks for joining me for another great episode. If Ulana's work moved you the way that it moved me, I strongly encourage you to check out her book, Torii. Supporting photographers by buying their books is one of the best ways to engage deeply with their work and to keep this kind of stuff coming. And while we're on the subject of books, if you haven't yet picked up The Colorado Way, I'd love for you to explore it. It features 20 essays about living with purpose and authenticity, woven together with photographs from my journey through Colorado's highest peaks and the Colorado Trail. It's a project that means the world to me, and I'm incredibly proud of how it all came together. You can find links to both of these books in today's show notes. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.